it's Brian here, and welcome to The Crown, a Clash Royale podcast where each episode we pick a topic, a strategy, a deck, or a card, and we talk to somebody who knows it well. And today on the show, we'll be discussing the different deck archetypes. We'll talk about defining a deck.
A win condition is the card in your deck that's going to take down your opponent's tower.
Playing each of the archetypes against one another.
So a siege deck never really makes that big push happen. It never really gives the opportunity to the control deck to make that positive elixir trade because it never invests elixir too heavily in one lane.
And analyzing and playing off of the meta.
It has pretty much been beat down world. Giant is by far the most popular win condition right now.
This is Deck Archetypes on The Crown. Today's guest has lots of experience analyzing the different archetypes. He's known for playing siege decks, and some call him the Mortar Mauler.
Hey guys, my name's Woody. I'm the leader of Reddit Alpha. It's a founding member of Reddit's Royale clan system. I've been playing Clash Royale since the very first day that the game was out on soft launch. I lied to say that I was in Canada to be able to download it. I'm actually from the States. But I have really enjoyed playing Clash Royale for the past year and a few months at this point. I play primarily siege decks, and I've been really involved in the competitive scene and the community of the game. I play up at the top of the ladder and in a bunch of big tournaments. You might have heard of big tournaments like Super Magical Cup and the Clash Royale North American Open.
Here comes a big log to push back the guards, and I think this is going to be a good enough defense. Now, Woody has made some insane comebacks before, just very recently.
And was also lucky enough to be able to broadcast big events in Canada, the Northern Arena Tournament Series. I broadcast in Quebec and in Toronto. And I've also been able to broadcast with BBXH, she's my partner in crime, the Esports World Conference tournament that took place about 1 month ago. The ESWC Finals, first 3 games in the finals, wins to the Royal GG, as he's called
Royal GG.
by some. And I've been to Helsinki. I visited the Supercell headquarters there to meet the Clash Royale development team. I am just so excited to do anything related to Clash Royale, and so it's my pleasure to be invited on to this cast to be able to talk to you.
Excellent. Man, you have an impressive resume.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, it just comes bit by bit. I don't know. I keep building up whatever I can work on next, and then opportunities present themselves. I try to take advantage of them, and they always wind up being a lot of fun and building to new opportunities.
As you mentioned, Woody's the leader of Reddit Alpha. He's also the founding member. Right
when I joined the game, I had a little bit of experience in Boom Beach and in Clash of Clans, and I was aware that there were Reddit clans in those different games, and so I looked for one in Clash Royale right when I got started. There was one that was out there, but it was full up. I couldn't join, so I made a new one. I named it after the Boom Beach task force that I was in at the time, Reddit Alpha, and just kind of grew it from there.
Now, they're a top 20 global clan. Last episode, we spoke to Nite Light about what it takes to keep a clan on the leaderboards. Does Reddit Alpha have a similar secret to success?
The secret to success is finding the right people, cultivating relationships with them, and leveraging the shared interest in building a community to get lots of people involved, get everyone doing exactly what they want to be doing, whatever level of involvement they want to go for. It is definitely not a one-man job, and it's something that I remind myself every day whenever I go onto our Discord server or talk to one of my friends about the game, that, man, there are literally dozens of people who are managing the organization now. It's hundreds of people in the organization across 8 clans, and it's not something that I do alone by any means. I think that the key secret there is the people.
If you're not already a member of the Reddit community, I highly recommend it. Make yourself an account and head over to the Clash Royale subreddit. It's the first place I go for the latest Clash Royale news, and it's got all the best strategy articles. Woody is a regular contributor there, and he's also one of the founders of the Reddit Royale clan system.
So those are all the different clans that exist from the Reddit community. It's not just the Alpha clan family that I manage. There's dozens more, and so I was very active at the beginning in the first several months as we were getting that set up, helping run tournaments and broadcasting them. I've also been very active on the subreddit in other ways, posting strategy discussion articles on a bi-weekly basis for several months now. The Clash Royale Card Popularity Snapshot is my recurring post that I do over there. I take a look at the top cards in the metagame and do strategy analysis on them.
So the meta is something that I think there is still some confusion around, maybe because it can be such a broad term. So meta basically means a second layer of itself. So a film that acknowledges itself as a film is meta, or collecting data about data is metadata. So the gaming that goes around the core game is the metagame. And usually that just means what cards, what decks, what strategies are popular.
Broadly, metagame in the general sense, rather than the specific sense of Clash Royale, the general sense is knowing how to play the game beyond just, I can use this card to counter this other card. It's knowing what typically happens in games whenever you are not actually in a match itself. Being able to build a deck that works well on ladder and in tournaments requires knowledge of the metagame. Because, for instance, if everyone were playing Minion Horde, then everyone and their mothers would be including arrows in their deck to be able to counter Minion Horde. But no one knows exactly what their opponents are going to be playing ahead of time. You just have this idea of what to expect based upon the most popular cards that are out there. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the Card Popularity Snapshot is really good at defining the metagame, because knowing what kind of decks you're most likely to go up against and the card combinations that go along with them is very important. For instance, Graveyard is a very strong spell, but it really does need a very specific set of cards out in front of it to work well, right? So you got to get a tank out in front. So Graveyard often gets played with things like Knight or Ice Golem or a Bowler, even to have a big tank on the front end. So knowing how cards work together and knowing which decks are very popular right now, you can best build your own decks to try to counter those popular decks in the metagame, and also know the best way to use the cards that you have within your own deck so that you have an answer to whatever your opponent might be trying to do at any given time.
So knowing the meta is valuable because it can tell you what to expect and what you should be ready to counter. But it's also valuable because it just tells you what's popular. And it's probably popular because it's a strong strategy and it's giving those top players good value. So if you're looking to round out your deck with a different card or try a new deck altogether, a good place to start is checking the meta.
I think that the second thing that players find a lot of use of in the snapshot is just the deck list that I provide. I originally just started listing all the cards from 1 to 50 or however many there were way back in the early days of Clash Royale. But then I started taking a deeper dive into the decks themselves and finding, there's 35 uses of Giant, but it turns out 22 uses of Giant are this one kind of deck, and 13 uses of Giant are this other kind of deck. So they're two separate decks entirely. So it's like a Giant Graveyard deck or just a Giant Beatdown deck that doesn't even need a graveyard in it. And so knowing how to build a deck, not just by throwing the most popular cards at the deck builder, but putting them together in the right order is also very important.
One thing to note is that all this data around the meta is collected off the ladder. So it's most valuable to you when you're playing on the ladder. But it doesn't necessarily translate the same to tournaments.
That's true. There are limitations to the data set. Obviously, there are differences between ladder competitions and tournament competitions. The two key ones are the fact that the overtime lasts 3 minutes in tournaments. It's only 1 minute on the ladder. And also that there are some differences between some of the cards in tournaments on the ladder. The fact that you can max out a card like Freeze and get a lot more out of its duration, or a card like Rage and have that last longer, means that those cards operate differently on ladder as opposed to tournaments. There is no real great way that I know of. I think you're right that there's no great way to identify the cards that are being used like in challenges or in all of the tournaments, put them all together in one big snapshot. We do get kind of piecemeal evidence here and there. If you look at big tournaments that take place, look at the cards that are in the decks that are winning, and you can piece it together from that. But there's no kind of authoritative, in that sense, way to find the best tournament decks overall.
Right. And Supercell doesn't share any of that data. Like, you don't get any of your data through them. You have to scrape it yourself?
That's right. I scrape it myself every weekend. At the end of every seasonal weekend, so it's every other week, I just go in there, take a look at the ladder, screenshot all the decks, and then type it on up in Excel and then analyze it from there.
Now let's get into the archetypes. So an archetype is a generalized form of something. And so when we're saying an archetype in Clash Royale, we mean a typical deck composition with the typical playstyle. And we use the archetypes to try to classify the main different variations in playstyle. It's something we touched on in our first episode with the Rumham. He actually defined the 3 archetypes that we're going to use in this episode. And that is Beatdown, Control, and Siege. But there's one last thing we need to know before we get into that. It's something that every deck has. It's called a win condition.
A win condition is the card in your deck that's going to take down your opponent's tower. A lot of times cards you'll have for defensive purposes, you need to be able to respond to a lot of different threats, a lot of your opponent's win conditions. So a card like Archers aren't typically thought of as a win condition, but they're a very strong card nonetheless. A win condition card would be something like a Giant or a Hog Rider or a Graveyard that is going to go directly to your opponent's tower, hit it really hard, and try to get the win. Now, it doesn't have to be a unit that targets buildings in particular. That does help a win condition to be able to go directly for the tower. But just in general, things that are going to be hitting the tower more often than just countering an opponent's troop is a win condition.
Does your win condition define your archetype?
Basically, yes. In some cases, you can get some kind of weird hybrid archetypes, especially if you're running multiple win conditions in a deck. And some of the best some of the best decks actually do have multiple win conditions in them, and they kind of defy the archetypes in some ways. But I'd say overall, when I'm looking at a deck, I'll say, oh, this is a Giant deck, or oh, this is a Graveyard deck, and it's kind of, or this is a Hog deck. It's defined by the win condition of the deck.
So the win condition is the card or combination of cards they're going to try to win you the game, and they're what we define the deck by. But on top of that, we have the main archetypes that we can also classify it as. And the simplest definitions of those are that Beatdown fights you on your side. They're going to cross the river to fight you. Control fights you on their side. They're going to wait and force you to cross the river to fight them. And Siege stays on their side and basically fires projectiles or troops and forces you to cross the river if you're going to fight them. Let's start by taking a closer look at a Beatdown deck.
Beatdown kind of encompasses all these really big body dudes that you want to build up a big push on your side, send all your forces through, and ideally you'd get the tower in one fell swoop. Sometimes it does take a couple of attempts to crack the defenses, but Beatdown focuses on getting big assaults to go onto your opponent's side of the map.
And they typically lead with a tank.
Yeah, you typically want to lead with a tank. The way that troops have been set up in Clash Royale, oftentimes you have guys that have a lot of hit points, and you have guys that can do a lot of damage. And it's pretty rare that those are both within the same troop. So that's one of the wonderful aspects of diversity within Clash Royale. You kind of have to have a great combination of cards to make your attack work. And so leading with a tank, having that distract the enemy defenders, and then using the guys that deal the most damage on the back end, like maybe a mini P.E.K.K.A. or a Musketeer or a Mega Minion, that tends to work very well for beatdown decks.
And one way that the beatdown accomplishes these big pushes is by usually starting their tank in the back. So they'll start their Giant or their Golem in the back, and as they walk to the front, they're accumulating more elixir, and so you've got more to spend on a big push and more support troops to put behind your tank. Now there's a flip side to beatdown, which is control decks. When beatdown wants to cross the river, control says, bring it on, come to my side where I have the advantage.
So a control deck really plays hard defense. They want to get a wonderful elixir advantage by playing on their side of the map, leveraging the fact that the towers can basically generate elixir by killing oncoming troops. And then once they get that elixir advantage, sending in a quick poke or prod at their opponent, not seeking oftentimes to take down the tower all in one big attack, but especially with things like Hog Rider, getting 3 or 4 swings here or there, sending in a miner and adding a poison onto that to go directly at the tower and try to eliminate any defensive troops. Those are really common ways that control decks can leverage the tower that they have to take out opposing troops and then counterattack in a funny way. And they can oftentimes counter these beatdown decks because they're very nimble. They often have very low elixir costs. There's a very popular Hog Cycle deck right now that has something like a 2.6 average elixir cost, which is insanely low when you think about it. The win condition of the deck is 4 elixir, and that's one of the most expensive cards in the deck. But yeah, that's what control decks want to do. They play slowly and steadily, trying to avoid big confrontations by tricking your opponent, kind of trying to prevent them from making that big push, disrupting their efforts to make that big beatdown attack happen.
And they, I guess they really leverage the defender's advantage because those towers can just grind troops up.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're often masters of distraction and, sending little 1 elixir skeletons down the opposite lane to keep a big 7 elixir P.E.K.K.A. from, ever engaging you, or, sending minions, really cheap little distraction cards like that to attack a ground-based, assault that can't actually hit the minions up top. So trying to get very cheap trades and, just defending smart. That's what the control deck does.
What do the what does an ideal control push end up looking like? Is it about taking a counter push and making that into your main push?
Yeah, there's a really popular control deck, the Hog Trifecta deck, that did this pretty well. Back middle or toward the end of last year, it was Hog Rider, Valkyrie, and Musketeer. And oftentimes what you would want to do is use the Musketeer to engage at a range, snipe down any oncoming troops, a Valkyrie to tank up front in case there was any attackers that you had to distract and keep them out of harm's way. And then once you countered your opponent's push and you had, maybe a middling health Valkyrie and kind of a weakened Musketeer, you would add a Hog Rider on there. And then you have a very threatening combination of splash damage, single target damage, the ability to hit ground and air units, and then a troop added on that would go straight for the tower when all else failed.
So a control deck is a natural response to a beatdown deck. And so the next thing is a siege deck, which is a good response to a control deck. How does a siege deck work?
So a siege deck never really makes that big push happen. It never really gives the opportunity to the control deck to make that positive elixir trade because it never invests elixir too heavily in one lane. It often will set up on the opposite side of the map with something like a mortar or a princess even, or an Expo. That doesn't really give the control deck the ability to leverage the defensive tower because it outranges the defensive towers. So when the best striking card that you have in your deck is a Hog Rider and your opponent can set up a mortar on their side, you play the Hog Rider to counter, and then your opponent has really high DPS units that can quickly nuke down whatever attack you send in, whether it's a Mega Minion or a Mini P.E.K.K.A. or even something as big as an Inferno Tower to stop the bigger pushes like Golem and Lava Hound. The Siege deck really excels in a different defensive way. It's also it's kind of a control deck in its own way, but doesn't ever try to go to the opponent's side of the map. Sometimes I'll play Siege decks that never actually have any troops at all across the bridge.
So do you usually accompany them with other buildings, either as like decoys for tanky troops or anything like that?
Oftentimes, yes. Those work particularly well in tournaments, by the way, because buildings last just as long in double elixir overtime, but your opponent is generating twice as much elixir, so you can very often get double the value out of your buildings. But in like an Expo deck, for instance, Expo is often run alongside Inferno Tower. That combo works very well for burning down small pushes that are coming in by use of things like Ice Spirit and Fire Spirits and chip damage from the Expo, and then can also eat up really big units like a Golem or a Giant or a Royal Giant using the Inferno Tower. The Mortar tends to be a bit more nimble, cheaper. I used to run Tombstone as the building, the secondary building in the Mortar deck that I would use to provide the distraction and damage on the front end to protect the Mortar. Cannon can also work well. I've seen players use Tesla even. And Tesla is actually the killer defensive card that went alongside Expo way back in the day when Expo, you could set it up on your side with 2 tiles in front of it, place a Tesla in front of the Expo, and then just go to town on your opponent's tower. By the time that they get through the Expo, or through the Tesla rather, the Expo is usually still really healthy. So that's one of the reasons why Expo got a range nerf middle of last year.
I find it, I've tried my hand at Siege. I am definitely not good at it. I find once you get your Siege building down, there's two things that then you have to do is defend it and try to get it to actually connect to the towers, because people are really good at distracting it. Do you have any tips for doing that?
Oh, sure. So on the first and defending it, it really just does take a lot of practice. The best thing that you can do is experiment with a lot of different defensive cards that can support the siege placement. So spirits are a really popular option because they essentially do the same thing that some other spells would do, except you're often just playing them directly next to whatever you want to hit instead of being able to cast the spell at something really far away. I'm not sure that was explained perfectly, but basically what I'm trying to say is that for a fireball, one of the great advantages for that is that you can play it directly onto your opponent's side of the map. You can basically get the same value out of fire spirits, but you only play fire spirits on your side of the map. But that's fine for a siege deck because you're only playing siege cards on your side of the map.
So they're much cheaper alternatives to spells.
Oh yeah, they're much cheaper alternatives to spells, and they don't work well if you need to play them on your opponent's side of the map. If you've got, your enemy is setting up some defense behind their tower that you have to reach really far back to hit, the fire spirits obviously aren't going to be able to reach there. But if you're playing them only on your side as a defensive measure, a card like fire spirits or ice spirit also is just a perfect addition to a siege deck, and they're often used in both mortar and expo archetypes.
Do you consider are spawner decks siege decks?
Yeah, to some degree. They kind of start to defy the traditional definition of the archetype, but you're not really sending too many troops to your opponent's side directly. You're just kind of playing the Sim City game where you set up buildings on your own side. So I'll classify those as siege. I'll give credit there. Miner also can kind of be considered a siege card as well, because you're not really giving your opponent the chance to defend against the miner. You just stick it directly onto their tower. So Miner and Goblin Barrel are two other cards that are kind of quasi siege.
Siege decks are the rarest archetype, and some people wonder if they're not actually being downplayed by Supercell themselves. I've got a quote from an Archetypes article here on Reddit. Supercell has made several statements that imply they do not want siege decks to be dominant in gameplay.
There's some truth to that statement. It sounds like you're quoting Bellator Gaius. His in-game name is Skyrear. He actually played for Reddit Alpha before he left the game, and he comes back and he leaves and he comes back. Well, I hope he comes back, but he kind of identified a trend that has been taking place where Mortar and Expo seem to only ever get nerfed, and they never really get buffed in a meaningful way because they are cards that are frustrating to play against. So even if they're not necessarily overpowered, if they are perceived as being a card that frustrates players, then they are more likely to be reduced in power. And that's something that is definitely true. It was actually discussed recently by one of the developers when they were talking about nerfs to, I think it was either Royal Giant or Elite Barbarians, where you have a really popular common card that's easy to get leveled up and upgraded. And as a result, players start to use it very often as a win condition, and it becomes an annoyance on ladder because it's something that's very easy to get highly upgraded. You can get a common that is easily 2 or maybe even 3 levels higher than your King Tower, and a card like Mortar, which is also a common, was able to do something similar to that. Expo was also causing a lot of frustration, even though it wasn't a common, because it didn't really have any easy way of identifying how to answer it, right? The same thing happens to a card like Sparky, that can become really frustrating for players who don't know how to get back at it, because it doesn't have a kind of traditional I shoot at you, you shoot at me type of interaction where most troops are just march from my side to your side and then we have an interaction. It's more long range or heavy duty explosive combat that can kind of frustrate, confuse, and so for those reasons, yeah, Supercell has kind of implicitly shown that they are less likely to be favorable in terms of balancing changes to the siege archetype.
Do you think they're going to start to downplay common cards that can end up being your win condition?
I think that the better option and something that they're more likely to do in the future, and something that they've shown in the past that they're interested in doing, is boosting the other card rarities, cards that are rare, epic, and legendary, making it easier for players to access those cards. They've made great steps actually toward that recently by releasing the epic chest and the legendary chest. The Electro Wizard event was really wonderful because if you were able to score 12 wins, you got a legendary Electro Wizard that you could use. And so trying to get those cards up to parity in terms of the other cards that you might be using in your deck will make it a little bit less frustrating to deal with the common disadvantage relative to rares and epics and legendaries. As regards the just kind of annoyance and frustration of dealing with an opponent who's using Siege, I don't really know if there's anything in particular that they can do to make Siege not siegey, not frustrating to deal with. But I guess it's up to them to figure out.
I think that's a good question because a lot of people, myself included, have found it super frustrating to play against Siege decks. They just feel like cheap. But that said, I've played them and they're not easy to play. So I don't know what the answer there is. Now, while we've covered the 3 main archetypes and playstyles, something we haven't mentioned is how those playstyles change when you get into double elixir and overtime.
The beatdown decks can often excel in double elixir time. Those are decks that make great use of the additional elixir. A 3 Musketeer deck basically plays defense for 2 minutes and then goes hardcore in double elixir time because you suddenly get all this additional juice to play around with, right? You can add on mini tanks here and there. The Ice Golem and Knight are both very popular additions to the 3 Musketeer deck because they provide answers on both sides of the bridge to both bridges rather, to a lot of different threats. Whereas a control deck will really try to leverage those first couple of minutes to get a hit in there. They often have win conditions that are really cheap, like 4 or 5 elixir pushes with like a Hog Rider, plus an Ice Spirit. And so they will try to get the chip damage in early on and avoid the long game that can tend to favor the bigger, heavier beatdown-y type decks.
So control, probably you're about the same. Beatdown definitely changes in overtime. Siege is probably about the same?
Siege, it depends upon the deck. Typically, I'd say that bigger, heavier decks with higher average elixir costs do better in double elixir overtime because they can more easily leverage bigger exchanges, right? When I'm using an Ice Spirit to try to shut down a minion push, that I know that I'm not going to have to face another big push for a while when we were in single elixir time. But when you get to the point where it's not just a group of 3 minions, but also a giant on top, or a baby dragon in the back, a golem coming at you, just being able to play little chippy defensive cheapo cards doesn't necessarily help out a whole lot. The Expo decks actually do quite well though in double elixir time. They can often build up double Expos on the back end. You can have one defensive setup and then one offensive setup, and they can kind of piggyback on top of each other. So it just kind of varies based on the deck.
The Rumham, when he kind of outlined those first deck archetypes, he also mentioned the rock, paper, scissors effect, which is, control beats beatdown, beatdown beats siege, siege beats control. What about when you play your own archetype? How does the game change?
In a mirror match, that's a great question. I don't see a whole lot of mirror matches, to be honest, when I'm playing Mortar, just because not a whole lot of people play Mortar. So I'm actually probably the least qualified to talk specifically about that, except that I do watch a lot of matches. I am engaged in competitive play, and I do try to think about that a lot. The big important factor there is who knows the deck better, and the second most important factor, if they both know their decks relatively well, is who got the better cycle to begin with. So it does become a sort of RNG factor where if you started out with the right cards, you can often build up the correct push, the ideal push that you would want to start with. And if you don't have those cards, you often have to cycle into them to get into your ideal rotation where opponent plays A card, you respond with B, they play C to counter that, you play D. If you don't have D at that point because you started off with the wrong rotation, then they can get an early lead that gets you into a negative elixir situation where they can get lots of damage off on you or pump up even worse if you're playing in a big golem versus golem beatdown deck. If someone gets a pump early in the game and they can get an elixir advantage using that, then it can often be curtains for you. It's terrible. It's awful. One
good tip I did read about mirror games is put in a card that you hate playing against in that deck. So if you're a Golem deck, put that in Inferno Tower in there.
Yeah, that's a good piece of advice. If you're, a beatdown going up against a beatdown deck, yeah, just play the card that you don't like going up against. Makes perfect sense because it's likely the thing that counters that deck the best. The only difficulty with that is that sometimes the card that does well against you doesn't often fit in the deck that you're using. So big heavy beatdown decks sometimes, in fact, don't use Inferno Tower because they have other ways of getting really big damage off onto their opponent. Glass cannon type troops like Mega Minion and Musketeer that we were talking about earlier will often be the support troops in those decks, but they can be the cards that are taking out their enemies' tanks in the meantime. So Inferno Tower is a beast, but it's not always an easy answer. Swap one card out, one card in that you think is going to counter your opponent in that way.
I remember when I called you originally to ask you if you would come on and talk about this with me. I said like, I'm super analytical and I really like classifications and I want to kind of nail down all these decks. And you said, that's something like, that's great, but it's not a science, it's an art. And I think you're right, because a lot of these times, like, okay, well, you can split hairs into putting this into a beatdown category, but if it doesn't play 100% like a beatdown, it doesn't do you any good to treat it like one.
Oh, sure. I've got a really, I think, pretty good example for you on that front. I think you talked about some cards before that you can't really pigeonhole into one specific archetype. Spellbait is like a great example of this, I think, because it's not really ever building up to a huge push, right? You never really have one big tank that's stomping across the field onto your opponent's side of the map. But if you've got a skeleton army, 19 skeletons, a minion horde coming at you, and then a goblin barrel gets thrown on, how can you not call that a beatdown? It's a ton of big, damage about to be dealt to your tower. It's not one single dude at a time. On the same flip side, it's not really a control deck either, because oftentimes they play very aggressively, very offensively, not trying to control the pace of the game, but rather trying to throw it in your face. So.
And I think they leverage you into making poor elixir trades because you've used up your one good one.
Right.
Or two or something.
Yeah, exactly. If they, are only really worried about you playing arrows against them, once your arrows are out of hand, they say, okay, well, yeah, now it's time to go.
What about countering those three archetypes? Like, what's your best way to dismantle a beatdown deck?
The best way to dismantle a beatdown deck, if you're playing control, I'd say is to just pressure the opposite lane. You can often do that with a cheapo motorcycle deck running Siege as well. If they drop a big old giant, or especially something like a Golem or a Lava Hound on the right lane, you just send in an attack on the left lane, and you disrupt their push by forcing them to spend elixir in the opposite lane, or by just basically losing their tower. Because a lot of times if you don't even answer an attack, even a cheap one like a 4 elixir Hog Rider, you'll lose upwards of half of your tower.
Yeah, so you would say, their aim is to build a really big push, and if every time they try that, you force them to respond on the other side, that's a good way to kind of put a wrench in their plans.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess on a more simpler level, if you don't get a chance to do that and you're having to defend against the push, separate the tank from the troops on the back end. Try to use a building. Oftentimes, big heavy tanks will target buildings. Try to use a building to distract them, draw them into the center of the lane. We call it the kill zone, where both towers can engage the tank. And then on the other side, on the outer edge of the map, drop whatever troop or spell you need to do to take care of their support troops on the back end.
I think it's important to put that troop separately. Never put that troop in between your distraction tower and your king tower, because then they're perfect for fireballing or lightning with a nice elixir trade.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great point. You never want to clump up your guys too much if you can avoid it.
So what about countering control decks?
Countering control decks. So Siege works pretty well against control decks. Oftentimes they don't have the firepower necessary to tear down a Siege placement. But if you're not playing Siege, if you are just going for the standard beatdown deck and you're trying to get through, I'd say know when it's okay to take tower damage. Just know when you don't have to counter something. Playing for smart elixir trades is good, but if you can afford to take 800, 900 damage on a tower by letting half health musketeer creep on in and get a few pop shots off then that's fine. Don't invest the elixir. If you've got mostly 5-6 cost cards that you're looking to play, and there's no like nimble way to respond to a small attack, just make a bigger attack in the other lane. It's once again an art, not a science. It's hard to determine exactly when is the right opportunity to do that, but that comes with experience, and it's something that experienced beatdown players are very, very good at.
And now I guess maybe I should just ask you, what is the most frustrating playstyle for you to play against, given that you're a Siege player?
Ooh, the most frustrating playstyle I gotta say is Royal Giant Furnace. There's pretty much no chance that I have to connect with the tower at all when they have two big targets like that I have to be able to drill through before I can get a lock on. It is just very demoralizing to know that when my primary win condition is something that requires there being nothing on their side of the map, and they have two big cards that can pretty much have a constant presence on their side, then it's a bummer.
And they're both, I mean, great cards in their own ways, that they're causing problems for you at the same time. Like they're an offense as well as screwing up your offense.
Right. You don't often think of them as counter push cards because the Royal Giant doesn't really engage until he finds a building. But when your win condition is a building, then it all of a sudden becomes a massive problem for you.
Yeah. We touched on bait decks. What about cycle decks? How does a cycle deck work?
A cycle deck often has a very low elixir cost, something between 2.5 and 3 usually, and will incorporate super cheapo cards like Skeletons and Ice Spirit, so that by the time your opponent plays a counter to whatever your win condition is, like usually Hog Rider, they drop their cannon, they're like, haha, I've got you right where I want you. You know, they counter your win condition, and then they prepare to make their push happen. While they're doing that, you just play really cheap cards and get to your win condition again before they can get to their defense to that win condition. So you get to your Hog Rider, there's no defensive building to distract it, and so even if you're making negative elixir trades, on face, or maybe on paper, ultimately you are doing the right thing in the long run by preventing your opponent from getting the value that they need out of their cards.
So some cheap cards like Ice Spirit, Skeletons, pretty quickly for 4, 5, 6 elixir, you can be back to your hog again.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of archetype popularity in the meta, what's the most popular? Has it pretty much been Beatdown World?
It has pretty much been Beatdown World. There are, always exceptions to the rule, but Giant is by far the most popular win condition right now. He's in a third of all decks at the top of the ladder. Does just very, very well. He's just wonderfully statted. He's only 5 costs, so it's difficult to punish an opponent who drops a Giant because they still have a pretty decent pool of elixir to play around with on defense. And he's just big enough that it pretty much takes an Inferno Tower to burn him down, or something that has really high DPS to chop through him if he's not otherwise distracted from going straight for the tower. And he provides like the ideal window of time to get whatever you need directly onto the tower. Sometimes it's a graveyard that's a really popular Giant deck right now. Sometimes it's just a straight up Giant beatdown. We see him being played with support troops like Minions and Musketeer, Mega Minion a lot. So Giant's really popular. Siege is doing decent. It's one of the most popular win conditions is Expo right now. But I think as Giant becomes more and more popular, unless the Giant players are just getting swindled left and right, not realizing how to counter the Expo, I think that Expo will continue to kind of be lower on the totem pole in terms of popularity.
So control deck might suit you well then. If you were to say you're playing against the meta, you might play more control decks?
Yeah, you might try to play more control decks. There's Hog Rider decks that can do very well against those big Giant beatdown A-type decks. Smart players have been using those in tournaments to try to counter opponents that they think are going to be playing big old beatdown attacks. But even having a good counter, it's sometimes difficult to pull off a perfect defense against a Giant deck. There's often very little room for error. So that's kind of how the metagame develops, right? When Scissors is supposed to beat Paper, but Paper still sometimes beats Scissors, the metagame is reflective of that when Giant becomes more and more popular, because the counter to Giant is not as prevalent or as popular or as effective as it's supposed to be.
Do you think it's Supercell's goal to completely balance it? Like, do you think in a perfect world, all cards would be balanced?
I don't think so.
Like your snapshot would kind of fade?
No. I don't think that's a perfect world at all. They actually had a developer go to the Game Developers Conference this past week and talk specifically about what you're asking here. And he referred to it as spiciness. He likes that some cards are spicy. He says that they don't necessarily need to be perfectly balanced, but that if your opponent doesn't know how to answer them, or if they come as a big surprise, they can get a lot of value by an unprepared player. And I think that most cards should be considered viable. There ought to be a deck archetype out there that you can fit it into and have it work. But it's not necessarily the ultimate goal to have them all kind of at equal level of use. I think it would be pretty difficult to do that, actually, since there are some cards that are really versatile, right? Like the Log or Zap are spells that work against half of the troops out there pretty well. Whereas a card like Expo only works in really certain circumstances when you need to have it as a win condition in a Siege archetype deck that's built specifically for that. So don't need perfect balance there in terms of usage of cards. I think balance is more accurate in terms of the win rate for a card. So if a card has a 50% win rate, then that's ideal. That's what we're really striving for.
That's interesting. Is there anything? What's the main thing that you've learned from observing the meta so frequently, like you do?
That players are really creative, and when you think that you know everything about a card, all you got to do is check some of these TV Royale replays or some of these top tournaments to learn that, there's like a different interesting tech that I can use. If I place it at this exact time right here, then I can get a really positive elixir trade that I didn't expect I'd be able to do. Shout out to Yarn. He's actually the godfather of the positive elixir trade and does some wonderful tech videos over on the OJ channel.
Yeah, I was listening to your talk with Clash with Ash, and you kind of talked about, that how, like, as people learn something and then it will click, like when Graveyard came out, and then people were countering it okay, but then people realized that they can couple it with poison or freeze, and it shoots up.
Yeah, whenever someone finds that killer card combination, it often spreads like wildfire. And I really enjoy talking with Clash with Ash about the card popularity snapshots. I'm actually about to talk with him about the 24th one pretty soon here. But the great thing about a social game like Clash Royale is that players are oftentimes going to win a game or lose a game horribly to a really strong deck. They go into clan chat, they share it, they go out and share it on Twitter, on Reddit, on the forums, wherever. And then people get to learn about the killer new combination and try it out for themselves.
What's next for you, or like what else have you been working on?
The Reddit Alpha Invitational, where we had 16 players from the top of the ladder in the community participating in some awesome games. So go check out the video that should be up for that, probably on Marcel P's YouTube. But what else am I working on? Just improving the Reddit Alpha clan family overall. Just always going to be publishing these card popularity snapshots as long as they're interested in them. I hope to be providing new content on the YouTube and Twitch fronts. But yeah, that's in general what I'm working on. And you can check out my videos over on YouTube and watch me stream live on Twitch. That's where I spend most of my time with the community, engaging them. And then I also tweet out on Twitter at Woody_CR.
Cool, man. Is there anything else you want to add while I have you?
No, I think that just about wraps it up. Thanks so much for inviting me. I've been really looking forward to our conversation. This is an amazing podcast series. I've enjoyed listening to it. And as I move further away from work in a few months here, I think I'm going to have even more time to listen to all the different podcasts that have been cropping up recently for Clash Royale. So I appreciate the opportunity to come on and wish you the best and hope we can talk again soon.
A huge thank you to Woody for joining us today. Be sure to check out his card popularity snapshot that we've been talking about, as well as his other streams. We've got links to all that on our website, crownpodcast.com. Now, if you remember last episode when we spoke to Nite Light about running a top clan, at the time, he was with Synergy, but he's since made a switch from running a top clan to literally running the top clan. a clan that's consistently at the top of the leaderboard. So I called Matt to follow up and get the scoop on him joining the Nova Esports family. Since we last spoke, actually just around the time that the episode came out, you had some big news that you were joining, was it Nova as a leader?
Yeah, so sort of my official title is general manager now. But it's really just, it's basically having a hand in everything. So whether that's helping with the competitive side, helping with the in-game clans, I'm currently building out the website for Nova, really just wherever it's needed and trying to grow Nova into a true esports organization. And
I saw you tweeted out about it at the time, but could you just tell us kind of what was your interest and motivation to make the switch?
Yeah, so I loved my time with Synergy. I loved the people there, and I loved the learning that I got there. There was some great challenges that I faced that I had to overcome, and I think I really grew with my time with Synergy. It was over 6 months. But it just became, in a sense, it became easy, where it was, in one sense it was really easy, and in one sense it was actually really tedious and really hard. And so what I mean by that is the day-to-day, the knowing how to run the clan, knowing how to keep it together, knowing the hurdles that I would face with just running a clan. I'd been through that. I'd learned sort of the best practices with it. It wasn't challenging for me anymore. But then at the same time, even though it wasn't challenging, there was still just a ton of work that had to be put into it. So end of season, every single season, making sure that people were at a high enough trophy level and bringing in other players to try to get a certain end of season ranking. Just constantly dealing with issues between feeders and everything. As much as I enjoyed it in the past, it was sort of the same thing over and over. And I was really looking for some new challenges. And this opportunity presented itself with Nova, where after me collaborating with them on Clan Royalty Championship Series, they saw sort of the impact I could have. And they felt that I would be a good fit for Nova, and so they made me an offer to join. And I thought about it for quite a long time, so I probably had that offer for a month and a half to 2 months. And eventually it just came to that stage where I really decided that I needed new challenges. I needed to move on to something else that was really stimulating for me. And on top of that too, I felt that given the resources of Nova, given the backing of AY, the owner, I could achieve a lot more there. Whereas with Synergy, it was very much begging for scraps at times. Whereas with Nova, the day-to-day in-clan stuff, that's almost secondary. That's not something I have to worry about anymore and devote time to. Instead, I can spend my time really learning how to be involved with an esports organization, learning how to approach sponsors, how to market ourselves. Those are the things that has always been my long-term goal. And so it just made sense to me to make that transition to Nova and to really allow myself to pursue these new opportunities to grow.
Cool. Is there, can you let us in on maybe what your ambitions are with them or what they're kind of planning to do next?
Yeah, so a part of it is just keep on doing what we're doing, which is in the competitive scene. Nova's been fairly successful, but just recently there was sort of a lull in the competitive scene where it was just the in-between of seasons for like CRL and CRCS, so there hasn't been much going on. But in that time, we've picked up arguably the best players in the world. Guys like CMC and Pompeo and Trainer Chris, who are undisputedly top-tier players and who are already showing significant success in competitive play. So that's one big thing. We're really trying to get a good structure behind our competitive system and ensure that we're dominant in the competitive scene moving forwards. In-game, it's really just maintaining the status quo. So that is maintaining number one on the leaderboards, on the clan leaderboards consistently, and trying to have someone finish number one globally. So fairly basic there. And I'm not as involved in that stuff anymore because I don't need to be anymore. It's very much self-sufficient. and Nova has a great team of guys to lead that in-game side. So beyond that, though, we're going to continue forwards with CRCS, so Clan Royalty Championship Series. We had a great response from the first season, and so we're looking to start up the second season in the next month or so. And beyond that, we've teased a few things out there, but there may potentially be a very big tournament coming from Nova, a live tournament in the summer. That's still up in the air. We're working things out, but it's definitely something to look forward to. And if not that, I'm sure that Nova's going to be involved in arranging competitive events, whether they're online or offline, in the future.
Congrats on the big move, and we're excited to see where you guys go with it.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks to Matt, and again to Woody, the Rumham, and just the whole Clash Royale community for the great reception we've been getting. It's great to hear back from you guys. Keep tweeting at us at Crown Podcast. Send your email feedback to theking@crownpodcast.com. And the biggest thing you can do is leave us a rating and a review in iTunes. It makes a big difference. Music in this episode was provided by A. Schroeder. We've got links to that and lots more on our website, crownpodcast.com. Check it out. And join us next time when we'll be talking to Hazard about running that 2.6 average elixir cost Hog Cycle deck. That and more next time on The Crown, a Clash Royale podcast.